MIG welding lesson and story time. Welding, for those of you who don't know it, is using heat to melt metal together into a homogeneous structure. Arc welding is when you use electricity as the heat source to melt those two pieces together, utilizing the resistance of electrons through a material. I'll mention that later. MIG welding is when you push a button and the wire feeds, and the wire here is what turns into the molten pool to kind of like glue the two pieces together. There's a power source behind the camera. There's a whole spool of copper. This is steel wire. It just looks like copper because it's covered in copper so that it doesn't rust in transit and storage. You're basically completing a circuit, just like when you turn on a switch. This is not energized right now. It won't happen until I pull the trigger. Pull the trigger, the wire feeds, it's energized, and my shielding gas comes through. There's an inert gas that also covers the weld to protect it from contaminants in the atmosphere. So, power source behind you, one lead. The second lead that you usually don't see in welding videos and people don't explain is that there are always two things. That's where the zapping occurs. Only you hook this up to your work or to the table attached to your work. That's what it means to be grounded. You always have to be grounded when you're arc welding. So now I can weld on this piece of steel because it's touching the table that is grounded, completing the circuit. So when I pull the trigger, it makes an arc. And without getting too deep into the physics of electricity, in MIG welding, you set the voltage, which is the pressure behind the arc, and the amperage is set by the wire feed speed. And it's all the heat behind the arc that's doing the work, melting those two pieces of metal together. And in constant power machines, which most are these days, you will set the voltage and then it'll keep up trying to maintain a perfect arc. The amperage is the amount of electricity. If you are likening this to like a hose, the voltage is like the pressure behind the water, and the amperage is the actual amount of water going through. With welding, it's always kind of this delicate balance of voltage and amperage to keep the perfect amount of arc and the perfect pressure going into your workpiece. MIG welding is the one that's a little bit different. You set your amperage with stick welding and TIG welding. I'm coming around to a story with this. All you need to understand is that if I have my machine set perfectly right now to make a perfect little weld bead at about a 1/4 inch stick out, meaning a 1/4 inch between where it's energized there back in the contact tip and my workpiece, and I can follow along that arc gap, I'll demonstrate. You're going to use the resistance of the electrons traveling through that electrode to do your work. Resistance is just that. If you're telling me we're going out somewhere that's got a dress code, I'm going to be like, I'd rather go somewhere else. I'm going to put up some resistance about going there. Children are experts at putting up resistance to things. And as much as the arc wants to travel from point A to point B, it's going to encounter resistance along the way, especially when it jumps through the air, like lightning. And that's actually how electrical switches work. If you could look inside of your light switch, when you see it turn on, there's a little bit of a jump, a spark in between where the current starts to run into a circuit. And that's all welding is. Grounded workpiece, energized wire. When it makes contact, you can see that it's heating up at the very end, not up here, but toward the end. That's where all the electrons are trying to jump that arc gap to get to the grounded workpiece. So it's basically made of filament. The machine is working very hard to produce enough amps to burn off the wire. So even though I've got this set up really, really well to run a tiny little bead, I'm doing some artwork here, if I have too far of a stick out, the wire's not going to burn off and it's just going to build up, and penetration is going to be really bad. You're not going to get any good penetration with this. But penetration will increase if you jam this right into the workpiece. That's not always good, and copper arc strikes are not good. Watch what happens as I shorten up the arc gap. Want it to sound like bacon. That's just one more thing that you have to think about when you're MIG welding, because you've got your work angle and your travel angle, you've also got your stick out. Additionally, the shielding gas coming out of this nozzle, if you get too far away, it's not going to do any good. It's not going to reach the weld puddle. So your amperage is being affected by not only the wire feed speed, but also the stick out. So as you just saw, let me tell the story. This happened at the boiler shop before I was hired on. One of the things that you don't want to get into the habit of doing is like tossing your lead down and walking away, which is what happened to this nice fellow. We worked in an ASME code shop, which meant that everything was X-ray, 100%. All of the tube welds and tube joints had to be perfect, because if you can imagine a pressure cooker in your house failing and, blowing up in your face in your kitchen, but then, make that 17 stories tall, that's what we were working on. And when they blow, people lose jobs and other things. So they were very fussy about how these tubes went out the door. Like, you couldn't have arc strikes on the tubes. You couldn't have nicks. If for some reason you had your grinder out and you were fixing something and, you know, your grinder caught and jumped or something like that and gouged into one of the tubes, you're going to be sanding it out before you even call an inspector. And the inspector still might ask you to butter up the tube a little bit with some real low amperage TIG and some 16-inch wire and then sand it off flush. They will be out there with depth gauges. And copper strikes were a huge no-no. If there, for some reason, was a little bit of copper impregnated into those boiler tubes, you were grinding it out and sanding it off. Lest you get an NCR, which was a non-conformance report. They're not fun. Get enough NCRs, you lose your stamp, which is your ability to do that work. A welder's stamp is their certification that they can do this job. It's their qualification, and it's a way to trace the work back to the individual who did it and hold them accountable should something be wrong. And at this boiler shop we ran, I'm pretty sure 45,000's flux core wire, shielded. It was hot, and the beads were pretty clean. I don't like flux core, but when you've got a shielding gas on it, it's really quite nice to run. So this guy was under his hood welding, and his buddy called for lunch, and his guy's like, yeah, cool, let's go. And he threw his lead down and walked away, and the trigger was being hit. But since the wires started to feed out into a long string like that, there were no theatrics, there were no sparks, there was no buzzing, there was no flashing, there was just heat building up. And it built up, and it built up. And from what I understand, it built up on a tube and started to burn through it, and it burned like a quarter-size hole through a tube. It's like unheard of. And I don't know how they caught what was going on, but I can only imagine that like sinking feeling when you found out what would have happened. This is a real niche story. I'm not sure how entertaining it is for anybody else. But if you can just understand that these tubes that we were putting out had to be perfect, 100% perfect. And this poor dude just kind of like absently threw his equipment down and it started to feed out into a tube. Because like I say, usually you don't catch it unless you can, like, I've done it a couple of times in my life. You catch like this shiny flash of copper line kind of wadding up on the floor at your feet and you're like, ah! And if you're lucky, you can just snip it and like back it up on your spool and use that wire again, but sometimes it's too far gone. Also, I built a bat. By the way, as I'm editing this, I'm remembering that I'm wearing this necklace from Lisa over at Lab Guitars and Basses. She builds guitars and bass guitars. And she also makes these little mini boxes that are great for holding picks. Fits right in your guitar case. Go check her out.